Hello patrons and subscribers, I'm Random Rob, welcome back to the new show. And today we're going to be looking at one of the most notorious examples of Hollywood excess of the mid-90s, Kevin Reynolds' post-apocalyptic, post-global warming, science fantasy adventure, Waterworld. And I'm going to tell you 3 things you need to know about this classic flop, or is it a flop that's actually a classic? Let's find out. The genesis of Waterworld begins in the mid-1980s when writer-director Peter Rader wrote a screenplay for a low-budget Mad Max knockoff that would be shot on the water. Corman assigned the project a budget of $3 million. It quickly became apparent that a film of this type could never be made for that amount of money, and the project was shelved until Kevin Costner came across it. In the early 1990s, Kevin Costner seemed like he could do no wrong. He had had a string of critically acclaimed and popular films: Dances with Wolves, Robin Hood, JFK, The Bodyguard. All had done extremely well, and Costner was seemingly in the mood to take on more passion projects and films that would expand his range as an actor. I would also argue that the early 90s is when Kevin Costner did some of his most outstanding work as an actor. His performance in the movie The War as a Vietnam veteran suffering from PTSD is a fantastic performance in a otherwise not that great movie. Similarly, his work in Clint Eastwood's film A Perfect World as career criminal Butch Haynes is an incredible performance. Not a perfect film either, but its message about the toxicity of violence is pretty worthwhile, and I recommend that film if you've never seen it. His Western epic Wyatt Earp, directed by Lawrence Kasdan, though, failed to light up the box office. Nevertheless, Costner was determined to bring Waterworld to the screen. And what began as a low-budget Mad Max knockoff would end up morphing into a big-budget action blockbuster with a final price tag of about $235 million, making it the most expensive movie of all time in 1995. So here are my 3 things. Number 1, Kevin's Waterloo. Director Steven Spielberg famously warned Costner that shooting on open water would almost certainly double the production length of the film and lead to runaway cost overruns. Not hard to see why, considering Jaws only had 1 boat, 3 actors, and a mechanical shark, compared to Waterworld with its floating steel sets designed with the help of engineers from Lockheed Martin, the dozens of hand-built and or otherwise modified watercraft, and that the area they were shooting in off the coast of Hawaii was prone to hurricanes, which in itself held up production on numerous occasions. Now, although it's practically impossible to get a straight answer as to where all the money went in this production, there's a few things we do know. We know that Waterworld was originally budgeted for $65 million, and that before shooting had even started, the cost of the film hit $100 million. Where did the extra $35 million come from? We can assume that most of it was to rebuild the primary atoll set, which was destroyed by a hurricane. Having to rebuild this one set ended up using all of the available steel in Hawaii. Additional steel had to be brought in from California. Shipping anything to Hawaii from the States is not cheap, much less steel. Then you have to factor in having to ferry crews of local welders to and from land every day to do the construction. It also didn't help matters that all of the contracting done for the film from Hawaii was done at an overinflated premium. We know that by the time shooting wrapped, that Waterworld's budget had hit $175 million. Shooting had originally been planned to take about 90 days and ended up taking 156. Costner was on set every day, working 6 days a week. Film crew morale was not the best, partly to do with the fact that Costner spent the entire shoot living on a chartered yacht with, among other things, a personal valet, a chef, a hypnotist to help him get over motion sickness, a swimming instructor. The cost of the yacht and crew apparently ran around $4,500 a day and would add about another $700,000 to the budget by itself. And while Costner stayed on his yacht, the rest of the film crew was stuck in rented condominiums, which had no insulation. Waterworld also has the dubious distinction of being a major motion picture where the three lead actors in the movie, Kevin Costner, Jeanne Tripplehorn, and Tina Majorino, all were almost killed on the shoot. Costner in one scene where he was lashed to the mast of his double catamaran when a squall came up. Tripplehorn and Majorino when the bowsprit of the double catamaran broke off, sending Tripplehorn and Majorino into the water and having to be rescued by a dozen divers. Underwater stunt coordinator Norman Howell surfaced too quickly after a dive and got the bends, nearly killing him. He had to be flown to the island and hospitalized. In hindsight, it's really amazing this movie got made at all. Much less that it was greenlit in the first place. Ultimately, when advertising and distribution fees were added in, Waterworld clocked in around $235 million. Although the film would only end up making about $88 million in the United States, its worldwide box office was about $180 million. And again, the numbers get fuzzy because some of the box office profit is kept by the theaters, but by the best reckoning of the numbers people on the net, by the time all the box office numbers had come in, Waterworld had ended up making about $8 million. Not a resounding success, but definitely not a failure in DVD rentals and purchases, and ultimately Blu-ray purchases. Waterworld made a decent little profit, even if it ended up taking about 15 years to do so. Had the hurricane not destroyed the atoll set, had the shoot length not doubled, Waterworld could have been made for $100 million and turned a very respectable profit. Number 2, the world versus logic. One thing that director Kevin Reynolds and Kevin Costner really wanted Waterworld to have was a sense of future authenticity. And in trying to flesh out this future society, the script would end up going through dozens, if not 3 or 4 dozen, depending which article you read, rewrites. Among the more notable screenwriters who came to work on it would be David Twohy, who created the Riddick series, and Joss Whedon. Whedon described his experience of doing rewrites on Waterworld as 7 weeks of hell, in which he said he was basically a paid stenographer writing down Kevin Costner's thoughts for him. The original cut of Waterworld was rumored to be about 3 hours long, and much of what ended up being jettisoned from the theatrical cut would give more insight into the different groups in the film. The smokers, for example, while it's not entirely clear in the theatrical cut, were meant to be religious crusaders. So when the deacon, played by Dennis Hopper, for example, calls the mariner a demon, it's meant literally. The group known as the Slavers was originally going to play a bigger part in the story. They're only referenced in the film. There was going to be more detail in the final scenes where the mariner explains he's not just going back out to sea because he doesn't like living on land, but that he knows there must be other mutants out there and he wants to go find them. There was a, I think, 2-hour and 45-minute version of the film that aired on television, which included some of this material. There is also a fan cut of the film called the Ulysses Cut, which was actually picked up by a distributor and remastered in high def. I have not seen this cut of the film, but I'm definitely interested in tracking it down. Despite all the inspired attempts at world building. The fact is that Waterworld is so logically inconsistent that it's a film that really can't be taken seriously as hard science fiction, and would probably best be described as science fantasy. Among the more obvious contradictions, according to projections, if the ice caps completely melted, sea levels around the world would rise 400 feet. While this would certainly dismantle most of the world's coastlines, it would not cover up all the arable land on the planet. Probably the only way you would have a scenario like that happen would be if the Earth was struck by several comets. The use of gasoline in the film is ridiculous. I think the chances are zero that there would be any supertankers full of crude oil still floating around 500 years in the future. I think it would be much more likely that anyone using internal combustion in that period would be refining oil from whales. And probably the biggest logical problem in Waterworld is, how would anyone be able to tell where they are with no landmarks? The floating cities and structures in the film are not bolted to the ocean floor, so they would be drifting too. How do you figure out where anything is? How do you keep track of anything? Also, since floating cities like the atoll were destroyed in real life by a hurricane, what's to stop that from happening in the world of the film? I don't think any human survivors living on the water in that future would have any kind of floating cities. I think it would be much more likely that small communities would come together by tying their boats together when it was safe to and disconnecting when it was unsafe. One other inconsistency I noticed this time when I watched the film was when the mariner breathes for Helen underwater. Even if he's getting oxygen through his gills, he's still going to be exhaling carbon dioxide. Unless he has some kind of control over his body where he can force himself to breathe out oxygen, but I don't think so. And number 3, Universal criticism and what holds up. Universal basically threw Waterworld under the bus before it had even been released in theaters. As cost overruns increased, management made it clear they weren't happy about how the film was going and weren't expecting it to be profitable, and seemed only too happy to let the public know rather than supporting the film. One thing I find ironic about criticism from the time was a mostly unanimous sentiment that the film did not have enough likable characters. As a science fiction fan, I have to say this is probably the only case I've ever heard of where a post-apocalyptic movie has had a criticism about unlikable characters leveled at it. So what holds up in Waterworld? Ignoring the goofy science and logic, I think Waterworld does a great job of creating the feel of human civilization in decline, showing how cheap life is in this future. I think the mutant mariner is a great character. I think all of the locations and sets are very authentic and believable looking, even if some of them are completely impractical. But beyond that, why Waterworld works is because the core of this film, to me, is a story about a cranky man on a boat who has to deal with letting a woman and a girl into his personal space and slowly learning to trust and care for them. That, to me, is where Waterworld shines. When the mariner teaches Enola to swim, it's a great little moment. I think the mariner helping the survivors find dry land but refusing to stay is exactly the way that story should end. While there's a lot in this movie I can't suspend my disbelief about, I don't have any trouble suspending disbelief when the mariner is dealing with life aboard his boat. And I think ultimately he's just as compelling as a post-apocalyptic anti-hero as Mad Max or Vic in The Boy and His Dog. So would I recommend Waterworld? As a fantasy adventure, absolutely. I think it's a film that's been unduly criticized over the perceived hubris of Kevin Costner. Despite the disastrous cost overruns, what they built and did in Waterworld, it's all up on the screen. The sheer amount of watercraft and stunts, underwater photography, aerial photography. No one had ever tried to do an action film on the water that was this extensive in terms of labor. I think it's a miracle it got made at all, and I believe, watching it today, it's really a much better film than it gets credit for. And I think Kevin Costner knows it too. Was it an overly extravagant, financially disastrous film? Yes. Is it a bad film? No. So what did you think about Waterworld? Have you seen the Ulysses cut? Let me know in the comments below. And if you like what you heard, press the like button and subscribe, and consider becoming a patron of the new show. I could use your help. Alright, this is Random Rob, signing off till next time. Be excellent, and take care. The new show is made possible by generous support from viewers like Tony, Arnow, Skipnick, Christopher, Marion, Eric, and B. Thank you so much for your support.